The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the classroom, its rhythm a constant reminder of the seconds slipping away. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the test paper in front of him. The equations seemed to mock him, every symbol a challenge he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. His palms were sweating. His heart raced. As he stared at the sheet, something inside him stirred, a knot of fear mixed with frustration. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but the weight of the situation was almost unbearable. It wasn't just the test that had him nervous. It was the pressure. The pressure of knowing that, for some people, his very existence seemed to be a question. Can a kid like you even handle something this hard? The thought echoed in his mind, as it often did when he walked through the halls of Jefferson High School. People didn't say it out loud, but the looks were enough. The whispers behind his back. The way his math teacher, Mr. Kavanaugh, didn't seem to trust him as much as the other students. It wasn't just the school's resources, or lack thereof, it was something deeper. Something harder to see but easy to feel. It was the look of doubt that always lingered in the air when Marcus entered a room. "Marcus, you okay?" A voice cut through his thoughts. He glanced up to see his best friend, Jasmine, sitting across the aisle from him. Her warm smile did little to ease his nerves, but it reminded him of why he was here in the first place. For himself. For his family. For the dream he carried, one that had been formed from the tough, gritty streets of his neighborhood. "Yeah," he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice betrayed him. "Just thinking about this stupid test." "Don't stress it," Jasmine said, leaning forward, her eyes scanning the paper in front of him. "You've got this. You know the material." Marcus let out a breath and nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. This test wasn't just a regular final exam. It was the kind of test that had the power to define him, in ways he wasn't sure he was ready for. It was the test that would decide if he was good enough, if he could ever escape the cycle of being underestimated and dismissed because of the color of his skin, the zip code on his mail, or the lack of funding in his school. As he bent back over his paper, he could almost hear the voice of his mother, Tanya, echoing in his head, "You've got to show them, Marcus. Not just for you, but for all of us. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. You're more than what they think you are." But it wasn't that easy. He wasn't just fighting for his own future. He was fighting against years of stereotypes, years of being seen as less than. The words of his counselor, Mrs. Green, still stung. "Maybe you should think about a trade, Marcus. You're smart, but with your background, college might be a stretch." He shook his head, refusing to let those words get the best of him. He had already heard them before. They were familiar, like an old song he couldn't escape. But today, something inside of him clicked. Today, he wasn't going to just accept what people thought about him. He wasn't going to let them define his worth. Marcus turned his attention back to the test. The first question was a complex algebraic expression, one that he had spent countless hours practicing over the past few weeks. He reached for his pencil and began to work through it, his mind clearing with every line he solved. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosened as he began to remember why he loved math in the first place, the way it made him feel powerful, in control. The way it allowed him to escape from everything else that tried to hold him back. "Done already?" Jasmine whispered across the aisle, her eyes wide with surprise. She had been struggling with the same question. "Yeah," Marcus said, tapping the pencil against the desk. "But I don't know if it's right." Jasmine rolled her eyes. "Marcus, you're overthinking it. It's definitely right." As he scanned the next few questions, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. Maybe he really could do this. Maybe, for once, he could prove to everyone that he was more than what they saw. His heart started to race again, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement. Suddenly, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor caught his attention. Marcus looked up to see Mr. Kavanaugh walking down the aisle between the rows of desks, his eyes scanning the students as he moved. When Mr. Kavanaugh passed by Marcus's desk, his gaze lingered for a moment longer than it should have. Marcus could feel the weight of that look, the silent judgment, the skepticism. It was as if Mr. Kavanaugh was questioning whether Marcus even belonged here, in this class, with this test. It's just a look, Marcus thought, trying to dismiss the feeling. But it wasn't just a look. It was a lifetime of looks. Of judgments. Of people who couldn't see past his skin, his neighborhood, his circumstances. The ones who didn't believe a kid like him could belong in spaces where people expected success. His mind drifted back to the conversation he had with his mom just a few nights ago. She had been tired from working late, but she still found the strength to remind him of something important. Marcus, don't you ever forget that just because they don't see your worth doesn't mean it's not there. You have something they'll never understand. Marcus clenched his fists. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He had to prove it to himself. The ticking of the clock grew louder again, pulling him back to the present. His hand moved swiftly over the paper, answering questions one after another with a clarity he hadn't expected. As the last few minutes of the test ticked away, Marcus finished the final equation and sat back, his breath steadying. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the exam, he looked around the room. Some students were packing up, while others were still working. He caught Jasmine's eye and gave her a small, victorious smile. She grinned back, clearly proud of him. As they walked out of the classroom together, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The test was only part of the battle. The real fight was just beginning, against the judgments, the expectations, and the doubts that haunted him. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt ready. Ready to fight. Ready to show the world his worth. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The future was uncertain, but Marcus was ready to take it on, equation by equation. Marcus had always felt like he was running, though he didn't always know from what. From the moment he could walk, his feet seemed to carry him faster than his mind could keep up. Not that he minded. Running meant getting away, escaping from the things he couldn't control, his neighborhood, his background, the expectations that always seemed to weigh him down. Born in the heart of Southwood, a neighborhood just outside the city's downtown area, Marcus had always known life wasn't going to be easy. Southwood was a place where opportunities seemed to come in small doses, like rain during a drought. He had seen people in his community work hard every day, just to stay afloat. His mom, Tanya, was the embodiment of that work ethic, grinding it out every single day to make sure Marcus had a chance to do better. To rise above. Tanya was a force. She had raised Marcus alone after his father had left when he was just a baby. Though she never spoke much about his father, Marcus knew that his departure had left a hole in her heart, one she filled with her relentless determination to provide for Marcus. She worked as a nurse, often taking on double shifts just to make ends meet. And though their apartment was small and sometimes felt suffocating, it was filled with love, encouragement, and a sense of belonging. The kind of love that made Marcus feel invincible, even when the world tried to tell him otherwise. Her mantra was simple but powerful: "You're smarter than they think, Marcus. Smarter than they'll ever give you credit for. Don't you forget it." Tanya had always pushed him to be better, not just for himself, but for the future. She didn't want Marcus to follow in the footsteps of those around him. She wanted him to have options. To have choices. At Southwood High, Marcus had learned quickly that his world was different from the one his classmates lived in. There were kids who drove BMWs to school, who had tutors and study abroad programs, whose parents paid for their college applications. And then there was Marcus, living in a two-bedroom apartment with peeling paint, trying to keep up in a world that seemed to be moving faster than he could grasp. Even with his mother's unshakable faith in him, Marcus had always been aware of the unspoken barriers that stood in his way. In a classroom where half the students seemed to have their futures mapped out, he often felt like he was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into the trap of being underestimated. He remembered his first day of high school like it was yesterday. His hands had been clammy, his uniform felt too tight, and as he stepped into that crowded hallway, he had felt small. Mr. Kavanaugh had looked him up and down, taking a moment longer to assess him than any other student. The subtle look of skepticism in his eyes had been all too familiar. And that look had never disappeared. But Tanya had prepared him for that. She had warned him, time and time again, that people would look at him and see a problem before they saw his potential. She had told him that there would be days when people doubted him, days when he felt like the odds were stacked against him. And she had also told him that those were the days that mattered most. People like us, she'd say, we don't get second chances. So when you get your chance, you make it count. And so, Marcus had worked. He had buried himself in his studies, driven by the desire to make his mom proud. He studied in the small kitchen of their apartment, where the hum of the refrigerator was often his only company. He had learned to tune out the noise, the sirens from the street, the arguments from neighbors, the constant reminder that he didn't have what others had. He didn't need it. He had something better, the drive to prove everyone wrong. Jasmine had come into his life during his sophomore year, just as things had started to feel even harder. She was the complete opposite of Marcus, well off, surrounded by family who supported her every move. But somehow, she had seen something in him that no one else did. At first, they'd only exchanged polite greetings, but soon enough, Jasmine had invited Marcus to study with her. It had started with a simple math problem, then evolved into shared lunches in the cafeteria and late-night study sessions. She pushed him, sometimes in ways that frustrated him, but deep down, he knew it was because she saw his potential, even when he couldn't see it himself. Jasmine had become his closest ally, his partner in all things academic. And maybe, just maybe, she was the only person who truly believed he could make it. But even with Jasmine's friendship, even with the support of his mom, Marcus still found himself questioning if he was enough. Could he ever break through the walls of the school system? Could he prove that kids from places like Southwood weren't bound by their zip code or the limitations that others placed on them? One thing was for sure, he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not after all the years of sacrifice, of trying to fit into a world that had never really been his. Marcus wasn't going to let someone else decide his future. As the days passed and the test approached, Marcus could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. The question of his worth, the constant doubt from his peers, the invisible but heavy burden of being a black student in a predominantly white school, these were the things that kept him up at night. But they also fueled him. They made him want to prove that he was more than the labels that people tried to put on him. His mom always said, "You're a fighter, Marcus. Don't let anyone take that from you." And as he sat there in his classroom, preparing for the test that could change everything, he realized that she was right. This test wasn't just about numbers and equations. It was about proving to himself, and to the world, that he was worth more than they thought. That, no matter what anyone said, he was enough. And that was the first step toward breaking free from the chains of doubt that had held him back for so long. The day after the test, Marcus could feel the tension in the air. He couldn't quite explain it, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the way the other students acted, almost like they had known all along that he didn't belong there. Maybe it was the cold, dismissive glances from Mr. Kavanaugh, who now seemed to scrutinize every step Marcus took as though expecting him to fail. "Just stay focused," Marcus muttered under his breath as he walked through the crowded halls of Jefferson High, dodging the groups of students chatting and laughing. His head felt heavy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. "Hey, Marcus." Jasmine's voice pulled him out of his spiraling thoughts. He turned to find her leaning against the locker, a smile on her face, though her eyes were filled with concern. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with genuine interest. Marcus shrugged, trying to look confident. I think I did okay. I mean, I couldn't have done worse than last time, right? Jasmine raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying his forced bravado. Marcus, you're better than that. You know you're capable of acing this. I hope so, he said, forcing a smile, though inside he wasn't so sure. The weight of Mr. Kavanagh's glare was still heavy on him. Even now, he felt like the teacher had already made up his mind about Marcus. He felt it in the way Mr. Kavanagh's gaze lingered on him when he handed in his test, like the teacher was already writing him off. And that hurt more than Marcus cared to admit. Jasmine studied him for a moment before nodding. I believe in you, Marcus. You've worked so hard for this. You can't let them get inside your head. But Marcus couldn't help it. The doubt, the weight of expectation, it had already settled into his bones. It had been there for years, just waiting for the right moment to creep up and attack him when he was most vulnerable. He hated the feeling, but it was one he knew too well. I don't know, Jasmine. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He quickly glanced around, making sure no one else could hear. The last thing he wanted was for someone to think he was giving up. Giving in to the idea that someone like him wasn't meant for success. Jasmine placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. Marcus, don't say that. You've come this far. You're not going to let a few looks or comments get in your way, are you? Marcus looked into her eyes, seeing the strength and determination she carried, the same drive that had always pushed him forward. But it felt harder now. Every day, it seemed like more and more people were trying to prove him wrong. The more Marcus tried to succeed, the more people seemed eager to knock him down, reminding him that a kid like him wasn't supposed to make it to the top. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, Jasmine, he said, his voice thick with frustration. It's like no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She seemed to be thinking carefully, weighing her words before speaking. When she finally did, her voice was calm but filled with undeniable conviction. Marcus, you have a gift. Not just for math, but for seeing through all the nonsense that holds other people back. You know what you're worth, even when they don't. You're smarter than any of them, and they're too blind to see it. Marcus felt a knot form in his throat. She's right, he thought. He had to keep going, no matter how many times it felt like the world was stacked against him. His mom had always told him that the world would never hand him anything, and he couldn't let that truth make him back down. But the truth was, it was exhausting. Every day, he had to prove himself, not just to the teachers, but to the other students who didn't believe in him. To the people who saw his background and assumed he didn't belong in a class with kids who had never known what it was like to go to bed hungry or wonder if the electricity would be turned off again. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and Marcus stood up, his body still tense. Jasmine's hand slipped off his shoulder, but the warmth of her support lingered. As they made their way to their next classes, Marcus felt the familiar tension creep up again. Just as he turned the corner to head toward the math wing, he heard a voice call out from behind him. Hey, Marcus. He spun around to see Ethan, one of the more popular kids at school, walking toward him with a cocky grin on his face. Ethan was one of the students Marcus had always felt uneasy around. He was the type of kid who never seemed to have to work hard, someone who coasted through school while barely breaking a sweat. And he always found a way to make everyone else feel like they were less. Got your test results back yet? Ethan asked, his grin widening as he stopped in front of Marcus. Marcus tried to stay calm, but he could feel his stomach tighten. Not yet. Ethan chuckled, clearly not believing him. Yeah, well, I bet you didn't get anywhere near the grade you needed. I mean, you can't really expect to pass a test like that with your background, right? Marcus felt his fists clench at his sides, the old familiar sting of insult gnawing at him. He opened his mouth, ready to retort, but then he paused. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he didn't want to let Ethan see that he was getting to him. "Maybe you're right," Marcus said finally, keeping his voice steady. "But you know, it doesn't really matter. I'm not doing this for you. Or anyone else." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that response. "Yeah, sure. Good luck with that." Marcus stood tall, his mind racing. He could feel the judgment, the doubts, the weight of being seen as less than. But he wasn't going to let it drag him down. Not this time. He had something they didn't understand, something they couldn't take away. "See you around, Ethan," Marcus said, his voice cold as he turned to walk away. As he stepped into the math classroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The first round of the fight. And the road ahead was only going to get tougher. But Marcus was ready. He wasn't going to let them win. This was his moment. His time to prove that a kid like him could do anything, even if the world didn't believe it. And no one, not even Ethan, was going to stop him. The days following the test results felt like a heavy fog had settled over Marcus. He couldn't quite shake the unease in his gut, especially after the encounter with Ethan. Every time his mind wandered, he found himself wondering if the doubts were justified. Was he really good enough? Or was his mom right all along, teaching him that he had to push harder and harder just to be seen as equal? The bell rang on the following Monday, signaling the beginning of a new week. The classroom was buzzing with energy, but Marcus barely heard any of it. He had made it to first period, but his mind was elsewhere. Mr. Kavanaugh had promised that today, he would return the results of the test they had all been waiting for. The classroom seemed to grow quieter as Mr. Kavanaugh entered, holding a stack of papers in his hand. The weight of those papers felt heavier than any test result Marcus had ever received. He could almost feel his palms sweat, even though he wasn't the one who was grading. Mr. Kavanaugh cleared his throat and walked to the front of the room. "All right, class. I'm handing these back now. Before I do, I just want to remind everyone that this is an important exam, but it does not define you. The real test comes in how you handle setbacks." Marcus could feel his heart rate quicken. Was it really a setback? Was he about to face one? A heavy silence fell over the room as the teacher began distributing the papers. Marcus' mind raced. If I don't pass, what does that mean for me? Will I be stuck in this cycle forever? The moment the paper landed in front of him, Marcus didn't need to look at the grade first. His eyes went straight to the comments. There, scrawled in red ink, was the phrase that haunted him: needs improvement in critical thinking. Struggles with complex problems. His stomach dropped. It felt like the words were mocking him, reminding him of everything he wasn't supposed to be. Jasmine had told him not to let the doubt get in the way, but looking at those words, it was hard not to feel small. And yet, in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't the final judgment. But he couldn't deny that the sting of Mr. Kavanaugh's disapproval hurt more than it should have. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He needed to get a grip. He wasn't going to let a test define him. He wasn't going to let Mr. Kavanaugh's words break him. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself distracted by the thought of what the future held. He knew he had to work harder, that there was no room for complacency, but the weight of it all was crushing. His own doubt seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. It wasn't just the test results that stung, it was everything that came with them. The sneers from classmates who didn't think he belonged, the looks of pity, the constant, unspoken reminder that he was different, that he was one of the few black students in the school. All of it felt like it was stacked against him. During lunch, Marcus sat by himself. Jasmine hadn't come to join him yet, and he wasn't in the mood to deal with anyone else. He stabbed at his food absently, his mind miles away from the cafeteria. "Mind if I sit?" A voice broke through his thoughts. He glanced up and saw Carter, another student from his math class, standing by the table. Marcus hadn't really spoken to him much before, but Carter had always been friendly enough. Sure, go ahead, Marcus muttered, not sure what to expect. Carter sat down, his tray full of food. You get your test back. Marcus nodded, trying to mask his disappointment. Yeah. Carter looked at him curiously. You're one of the smartest people in our class. You've been kicking the math problems all semester. Why do you look like you just lost your dog? The question caught Marcus off guard, and he raised an eyebrow. It's just a test. Carter shrugged, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he understood more than Marcus was letting on. You know, I don't know if you've noticed, but people tend to write you off. They look at you, and they think you don't have what it takes. It's a weird thing, but I've seen it happen to others too. You get this unfair reputation. And for some reason, people think that because of where you come from or what you look like, that means you're not going to do well. Marcus couldn't help but feel a small surge of anger. It wasn't just that people doubted him. It was that they didn't even know him. They didn't know the late nights he spent studying, trying to make sure he didn't fall behind. They didn't know the sacrifices his mom made to get him this far. Yeah, I get that, Marcus said, trying to keep his tone neutral. But they don't know me. I'm just trying to do my best, like anyone else. Carter's expression softened. Exactly. And let me tell you something. That test. It's just one test. It doesn't mean everything. If I were you, I'd focus on improving, keep pushing. Don't let that grade define you. Trust me, I've seen you solve problems faster than some of these guys in here, and they've got tutors and everything. You're better than them, Marcus. The words were like a lifeline, pulling Marcus from the depths of his self-doubt. Carter didn't know the full story of his life, but somehow, he saw something in Marcus that others didn't. He saw his potential. Thanks, man, Marcus said, his voice quieter than before. He realized he wasn't alone in this after all. As the day went on, Marcus began to think about Carter's words. Maybe it wasn't about what others thought of him, but about what he thought of himself. He had worked hard to get to this point. He had come too far to let one setback throw him off track. By the time the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Marcus had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Mr. Kavanaugh's words hold him back. He wasn't going to let anyone make him feel like he wasn't worthy of success. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And he was ready to fight for it. The next few days passed in a blur for Marcus. He spent every waking moment with his nose buried in textbooks, his mind racing through formulas, equations, and problem-solving strategies. The initial sting of his test results had faded, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He had one goal now, to prove to everyone, including himself, that he belonged in this class. But with that determination came an unsettling truth: the road to proving himself wasn't going to be easy. Every corner he turned, it seemed like another challenge stood in his way. Mr. Kavanaugh's harsh grading was still fresh in his mind, and the whispered comments from some of his classmates were hard to ignore. The doubts, however, no longer felt as suffocating. They were there, yes, but Marcus was learning to push them aside, one by one. Jasmine had been a constant support during this time. She didn't offer platitudes or empty encouragement. Instead, she showed Marcus that real progress came from hard work, not from waiting for an easy way out. Her belief in him was unwavering, and that helped more than any words could. You've got this, Marcus. Just keep your head down, stay focused, and don't let anything distract you, Jasmine reminded him during lunch one day, her voice steady and full of conviction. Marcus looked at her, feeling a flicker of hope inside him. I'm trying, Jazz. But it's hard. Every time I think I'm getting ahead, something happens. Someone says something, and I feel like I'm back at square one. She smiled, her eyes glinting with determination. It's supposed to be hard. That's what makes it worth it in the end. Those words stuck with him, running through his mind like a mantra as he walked back to his next class. He couldn't afford to take any shortcuts or avoid the discomfort. If he was going to prove he belonged, he had to work harder than anyone else. And he had to keep his eyes on the prize, no matter how many times others tried to knock him off course. The turning point came the next time Marcus faced Mr. Kavanagh's class. It was a routine session, at least, that's what it seemed like at first. But as soon as Marcus sat down at his desk, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some curious, some skeptical, and some, he was sure, judging. "All right, class," Mr. Kavanagh began, his voice as stern as ever. "Today, we're going to tackle something a little more advanced. You've been working on the basic concepts, but now it's time to push your skills to the limit." Marcus sat up straighter, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared for this. He had done the extra practice, stayed up late studying each and every formula, each and every problem. This time, he wasn't going to let anything distract him. Mr. Kavanagh handed out a new set of problems. The math was harder, no doubt about it, but Marcus wasn't intimidated. He glanced around the room, seeing the confidence in the eyes of some of his classmates who had coasted through earlier lessons. But today, Marcus didn't feel like one of them. He wasn't going to fall into the trap of comparing himself to others. Instead, he took a deep breath, focused on the problem in front of him, and began working through the equations one step at a time. The class was silent as everyone worked, but Marcus could feel the weight of the eyes on him. He didn't let it bother him. As the minutes ticked by, he kept his head down, fingers flying across the paper, solving problem after problem. His mind was sharp. His focus was razor-thin. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt confident in his abilities. When the bell rang signaling the end of class, Marcus looked up to see Mr. Kavanagh walking toward him, his usual stern expression still intact. Marcus stood, bracing himself for whatever criticism might come. "Marcus," Mr. Kavanagh said, his voice measured. "I see that you've improved. But I need to remind you, you're still not where you need to be." Marcus felt a sharp sting at his words, but he didn't let it show. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Kavanagh's gaze was cool and indifferent. "You're making progress, but there's still a lack of depth in your understanding. You're quick to solve the problems, but you're missing the conceptual understanding. Without that, you won't be able to succeed in more advanced material. You need to dig deeper." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach, but he refused to show how deeply they affected him. Instead, he nodded. "I'll work on it. I'll do better." Mr. Kavanagh didn't respond, his gaze turning away as he moved on to speak to another student. Marcus stood there for a moment, the harshness of the teacher's words echoing in his mind. Was he right? Was he only solving problems because of memorization and not truly understanding the core concepts? Marcus felt a wave of doubt roll over him, but he shook it off. He could do better. He would do better. As he packed up his things, his mind raced through the problems he had solved that day. There had been a lot of challenges, but something inside him had clicked. Maybe Kavanagh was right about needing more depth, Marcus thought. But I'm not done yet. I'll figure it out. I'll prove to him that I can do this. When he stepped out into the hallway, Marcus found Jasmine waiting for him. She could see the storm cloud that was hanging over him, and she wasted no time in asking what happened. "Mr. Kavanagh didn't think I understood the material," Marcus said, his voice low. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Did he really say that?" Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the comment. "Yeah, he said I'm just solving problems without really getting the concepts." Jasmine considered this for a moment before speaking. "You've been doing more than just solving problems. I know you, Marcus. You've been studying like crazy. If anyone can show him that you understand this, it's you." Marcus looked at her, feeling a small spark of determination ignite within him. "Thanks, Jazz. I'm going to prove him wrong. I'm not going to let this stop me." As he walked away, he felt that familiar feeling of determination rise in him again. The climb was steep, and the doubt still lingered, but now, more than ever, Marcus knew that it was all part of the journey. He had a long way to go, but he was ready to face it head-on. One test, one comment, one challenge at a time. The following week was filled with tension for Marcus. He could feel the weight of the pressure mounting, and every day brought new doubts and new challenges. His encounter with Mr. Kavanaugh still lingered in his mind, the harsh critique gnawing at him, making it hard to focus on anything else. He wanted to prove Kavanaugh wrong, but it wasn't going to be as simple as just solving the problems faster. He needed to understand them on a deeper level. Marcus knew he needed a plan, and he was determined to follow through. The fire to prove himself, to show that he wasn't just another student in a class of average kids, was burning bright in his chest. He wasn't going to let Mr. Kavanaugh's words define him, or anyone else's. The next math class was a different kind of test altogether. It wasn't about a quiz or another set of problems, it was a group project. Mr. Kavanaugh had assigned everyone into groups of 4, and the project would be based on creating a detailed presentation about advanced algebraic concepts. For Marcus, this seemed like both an opportunity and a curse. He could already guess what it would look like. Some students would glide through the project with their natural confidence and charm, while others, like Marcus, would have to fight tooth and nail to prove they could pull it off. He didn't mind the hard work, but group projects always made him uneasy. There was always that one person who didn't contribute, leaving the rest to pick up the slack. But the moment Marcus saw who was in his group, his heart sank. Ethan. The same Ethan who had sneered at him earlier in the semester. The one who, despite his tendency to put others down, was always quick to volunteer when it came time to show off. Marcus clenched his fists under the table. He was going to have to make this work, but he wasn't sure how. As the class progressed and the groups got settled, Mr. Kavanaugh gave his usual, good luck, speech and left the room, giving the students the freedom to begin. The tension in the air was palpable, but Marcus couldn't afford to waste time being angry. He had a goal now, prove to everyone that he was more than capable. And if he had to deal with Ethan's attitude, then so be it. Ethan, already sitting next to Marcus, gave him a quick glance, a smirk barely hidden behind his hand. "You know, Marcus," he said, voice low, "I don't know if you're cut out for this project. Maybe you should leave the hard stuff to the rest of us, huh?" Marcus fought to control his frustration. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. He had bigger things to worry about. "Let's just get started," Marcus replied coolly, trying to keep his tone neutral. Jasmine, who had been placed in a different group, passed by and saw Marcus' discomfort. She offered him a sympathetic look but didn't say anything. It was clear she knew what was going on. But Marcus had a job to do. As the group began to divide tasks, Marcus found himself trying to take on more than his fair share. He was determined to demonstrate his knowledge, to show that he could handle whatever Ethan threw at him. He didn't care that Ethan seemed uninterested in doing the work. Marcus would take the initiative. Ethan, unsurprisingly, didn't make much effort to contribute, preferring instead to crack jokes and occasionally throw out an answer that was half-baked at best. Marcus was growing more and more frustrated, but he refused to let it show. He knew that if he let Ethan get to him, it would be just another excuse for people to think that he couldn't handle the pressure. He had to do this on his own terms. As the deadline for the project presentation approached, Marcus poured himself into the work. He spent hours researching the concepts, piecing together a detailed PowerPoint presentation, and writing out notes that explained the most complicated parts of the topic. He was committed to ensuring that the project was as strong as possible, but he couldn't ignore the frustration that built up as Ethan barely lifted a finger. The day of the presentation arrived, and Marcus could feel his nerves tightening. His stomach was in knots as they took the front of the classroom. Ethan slouched in his seat, practically disinterested, while Marcus stood tall, a mix of determination and frustration swirling within him. The presentation went smoothly, though it was clear that Marcus was doing most of the speaking. Ethan piped in only when he was asked directly, and even then, his answers were half-hearted and vague. But Marcus pushed through, explaining the equations, the theorems, and how they could be applied in real-life scenarios. His voice gained strength as he spoke, and with every word, he felt a little more confident. The material was clicking, he was finally starting to understand it, really understand it, not just memorize it. When it was over, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The class clapped politely, but Marcus knew that the applause wasn't for Ethan's half-hearted contributions, it was for his hard work, his effort to make the presentation shine. Mr. Kavanaugh looked impressed, but he didn't say anything yet. He never did, not right after a presentation. As they packed up their things, Ethan gave Marcus a quick glance. This time, though, the smirk wasn't there. "You did all right," Ethan muttered, almost as if admitting defeat. "Guess you're not as bad at this stuff as I thought." Marcus held back a smile, his heart still pounding from the intensity of the presentation. But he couldn't help the small feeling of triumph that grew inside him. For once, he hadn't let anyone's judgment hold him back. Later that day, when Marcus met Jasmine after school, he couldn't help but share what had happened. "So, how'd the presentation go?" Jasmine asked, her voice light, but there was an edge of curiosity in her eyes. "I think it went well. Better than I expected, anyway," Marcus replied, feeling the exhaustion from the day wash over him. "But it wasn't just me. Ethan didn't do much, but I still had to make sure it was perfect." Jasmine gave him an encouraging nod. "You've got the talent. I know it. But Marcus, you also have something that most people don't, determination. I don't care what Ethan thinks. You proved today that you've got what it takes. You've got more depth than anyone gave you credit for." The word settled in Marcus' chest like a warm glow. Jasmine was right. Maybe it wasn't about impressing Ethan or even Mr. Kavanaugh. It was about proving to himself that he was capable. He was more than just the stereotype or the kid with something to prove. He was Marcus, a student who worked harder than anyone else, a student who was ready for the challenge. The climb wasn't over, but for the first time, Marcus could see the summit in the distance. And he was going to reach it, no matter what. The following week felt like the calm before a storm for Marcus. After the group project, he felt a rush of pride in his accomplishment, even if it had been overshadowed by Ethan's lack of involvement. For the first time, though, he began to feel like he was not just getting by, he was moving forward. But life, as it often does, had other plans. As the week progressed, the tension that had been building in the background finally caught up with him. It started with the smallest of things. In class, Mr. Kavanaugh began assigning harder equations, layering complex ideas that even the most confident students in the class were struggling to understand. Marcus found himself spending more hours than ever before trying to catch up. His study routine was relentless, but the problems only seemed to multiply. Every time he thought he had mastered one concept, another would emerge, more challenging and more demanding than the last. Jasmine, though supportive, had her own set of challenges. Her grades had started to slip as well, and though she had always been a model of efficiency, even she found herself overwhelmed. Both of them were fighting the same battle, but now, it felt like the odds were stacking up against them. One particularly brutal evening, Marcus sat at his desk, the faint light of his desk lamp flickering above him as he scribbled furiously on his notebook. The stack of textbooks beside him seemed to mock him, their spines worn and ragged. His eyes were sore, his head pounding. It had been hours since he'd last eaten, but the hunger pangs were just another distraction he couldn't afford. He was close, he could feel it, but every time he thought he understood the equations, something in his brain just couldn't make the final connection. The frustration was beginning to feel suffocating. With a sigh, he shoved the notebook away from him, leaning back in his chair. The quiet of the night pressed in on him, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt that old, familiar doubt creep up again. What if he wasn't cut out for this after all? What if he couldn't do it? A knock on his door startled him, breaking him out of his spiraling thoughts. He turned, surprised to see his mom standing there, her face weary but warm. "Hey, baby," she said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been in here for hours. How's the studying going?" Marcus rubbed his eyes, trying to hide the exhaustion that was clearly visible. It's fine. Just a little tough, that's all." His mom stepped into the room and sat down next to him. "You've been at this for a while, haven't you?" She reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know you're frustrated. I can see it. But I want you to remember something, okay?" Marcus looked at her, his heart heavy. "What?" "You're doing this for you," she said, her voice strong, but filled with that quiet wisdom that always seemed to settle over him. "It's easy to get lost in what others think of you, but in the end, none of that matters if you've given it your all. And you have. Every single day. The hard work will pay off, even when it feels like it's not." Marcus nodded, trying to absorb her words. He knew his mom meant well, but in his mind, he wasn't sure it would ever pay off. His classmates seemed to move through the material so easily, and he was still struggling with the basics. "I know you've got it in you, Marcus," she continued. "Don't let this moment define who you are. Every challenge, every setback, is just another step to your victory." He managed a tired smile, grateful for her support, even if it didn't fully wipe away the doubt. That night, Marcus fell asleep at his desk, his notebook open in front of him. His mom's words echoed in his mind, but sleep didn't come easily. The worry, the uncertainty, they were too loud. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a start, the clock on his desk blinking 7 a.m. He had overslept, and in a panic, he scrambled to get dressed and grab his things. He barely had time to eat, his mind still hazy from a restless night. At school, things didn't get any easier. In fact, it felt as though they were getting worse. Marcus had always been quiet, and now that he was struggling, it only seemed to make him more isolated. When he walked into Mr. Kavanaugh's class, there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. The rest of the class was faring no better than he was, but somehow, it didn't make him feel any better. When Mr. Kavanaugh handed out the next quiz, Marcus felt his stomach drop. The equations were beyond difficult. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, the ink blurring in front of his eyes. He could feel the stares from his classmates, the subtle but unmistakable whispers. He wasn't ready for this. Not at all. As the quiz dragged on, Marcus could barely focus. His mind kept racing, spiraling into a whirlwind of worry and doubt. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the class, Marcus felt physically exhausted. He hadn't answered half of the questions. He looked around. Ethan had already finished, his test handed in with confidence. Other students were chatting and laughing as they left the room, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to join them. Jasmine was waiting outside the door for him. She immediately saw his troubled expression and approached him. "What happened?" she asked gently. "I don't think I did well," Marcus admitted, his voice tight. "The equations, they were way over my head. I couldn't keep up." Jasmine gave him a sympathetic look. "Hey, it's just one test. You've been pushing yourself hard. Maybe you just need a break, yeah? You're doing great, Marcus. I know it's hard, but you're stronger than you think." Marcus wanted to believe her, but the weight of failure felt suffocating. It wasn't just about the test. It was about everything, every struggle, every setback that seemed to push him further into the shadows. Maybe he wasn't strong enough after all. But Jasmine's words hung in the air, reminding him that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to fight. And fight he would. As he walked out of the classroom and into the bustling hallways, Marcus realized something: the road ahead was going to be long, and it wasn't going to get any easier. But that didn't mean it was over. Not by a long shot. The storm was coming, but Marcus was ready to face it. The days after the quiz felt like an unrelenting flood. Marcus's confidence, once boosted by his small victory with the group project, had started to sink into the murky waters of self-doubt. He spent more time staring at his textbooks than actually making progress, feeling the weight of each passing hour bearing down on him. Every attempt to study felt futile, like he was stuck in quicksand, struggling and sinking deeper. His friends noticed it, too. Jasmine had become more concerned as Marcus withdrew into himself. At first, she tried to cheer him up with encouraging words, but the strain was evident in her eyes. She knew he was fighting a battle inside his mind, one that no amount of motivational speeches could change. On Thursday afternoon, after another long day of unproductive study, Marcus found himself sitting on a bench outside the school, watching the other students chatting and laughing as they left. It felt like a world that didn't quite include him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, half expecting another reminder of the latest assignment. But this message wasn't from a teacher or classmate. It was from his mom. "Hey, baby, how's everything going? You've been really quiet lately. Talk to me when you can. Love you." Marcus stared at the screen for a moment before putting the phone away. His mom's words, always full of encouragement, felt distant today. He was too wrapped up in his own head to talk about how he felt. How could he tell her that the very thing he was working so hard for, the thing that he put his heart and soul into, was slipping through his fingers? Jasmine found him there, alone and lost in thought. She sat down beside him, crossing her arms over her chest. "Marcus, you haven't been yourself," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I know you're struggling, but shutting everyone out isn't going to help. You need to talk about it." Marcus looked at her, his heart heavy. He'd been avoiding this conversation for days, but the words bubbled to the surface, threatening to spill out. "I'm just so tired, Jasmine," Marcus confessed, his voice cracking. "Every time I think I'm getting somewhere, I fall behind again. I don't know if I can do this anymore." Jasmine's eyes softened. "I know it's hard. But Marcus, you've been working so hard. You've already come so far. You're not going to let one bad test or one tough week stop you, are you?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, his head hanging low. "I've been trying so hard to keep up with everything, and it feels like nothing I do is good enough. I don't think I'm cut out for this." "Don't say that." Jasmine turned to face him, her expression serious. "You are absolutely cut out for this. You've been pushing yourself harder than anyone I know. You're not failing, Marcus. You're just not seeing the progress yet." Marcus shook his head. "It feels like I'm failing." Jasmine took a deep breath, her voice steady. "Then let's shift your focus. Stop worrying about everything all at once. Let's focus on one thing at a time. I'm here to help. Let's tackle this together." Her words hit him like a punch, but in a good way. He'd been so caught up in the pressure to excel in every single area that he hadn't stopped to think about breaking things down into manageable steps. The enormity of the challenge had paralyzed him, but now, Jasmine was showing him a different way forward. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she continued, "but you can't give up. Not yet. We're in this together, okay?" Marcus nodded slowly, the fog of doubt beginning to lift. For the first time in days, a glimmer of hope sparked within him. Jasmine was right. He didn't have to do everything at once. He just needed to take it step by step. "Thanks, Jasmine," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and the students began filing out of the building. But Marcus no longer felt quite as lost as he had that morning. There was still a long way to go, but now he had a plan. The next day, Marcus made a decision. He was going to do this differently. Instead of poring over all his assignments at once, he would start with the most immediate one and break it down into smaller chunks. No more obsessing over the bigger picture. That evening, he opened his math textbook, determined to focus on just the next section. He read the first problem carefully, allowing himself to digest it piece by piece. It took time, much more time than he had anticipated, but it felt manageable. Each answer wasn't perfect, but it was progress. When Jasmine checked in on him later that night, she found him still hunched over his desk, a cup of coffee beside him. He looked up as she entered, a weary but proud smile tugging at his lips. "How's it going?" she asked, her tone light. "I'm making progress," Marcus replied, his voice calmer than it had been in days. "It's slow, but I think I'm starting to get it." Jasmine grinned. "That's the spirit. Keep going, Marcus. You've got this." For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the pressure lift, even if just a little. He wasn't going to be able to fix everything overnight, but he could make small steps forward. One equation at a time. The following week, as Mr. Kavanaugh handed back the most recent quiz, Marcus took a deep breath. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the paper. When he saw the score, a surge of relief washed over him, an 87%. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. And that, Marcus realized, was enough. As the days passed, he started to regain his confidence. He kept working steadily, focusing on the process rather than the end result. It wasn't easy, but with Jasmine's help and his own determination, Marcus was finally starting to feel like he was in control again. But there was one thing that still hung over him, Mr. Kavanaugh's harsh words about the quiz scores. Marcus wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew that whatever happened, he wasn't going to let that judgment define him. Not anymore. He was ready for whatever came next. Marcus's small victory with his math quiz had given him a renewed sense of hope. He'd managed to push through a difficult week with a sense of accomplishment that had eluded him for far too long. But, as often happens when things seem to settle, life found a way to introduce another curveball. It started with an announcement from Mr. Kavanaugh at the beginning of class on Monday. "All right, everyone," Mr. Kavanaugh said, adjusting his glasses and looking at the class with a stern expression. "Next week, we'll be taking a cumulative test on everything we've covered so far this semester. This will be a big one, so make sure you're prepared." Marcus's heart sank. The previous quiz had been difficult enough, but now he had to study everything from the past few months. The weight of the announcement felt suffocating, and as the bell rang and the students began packing up to leave, Marcus felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He barely heard Jasmine's voice as she called his name, trying to get his attention. "Hey, Marcus, you okay?" He looked up, startled, realizing he'd been staring at his desk for far too long. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice a little strained. "Just thinking about the test." Jasmine's brow furrowed. "I know. It's a lot. But hey, we've been tackling the material bit by bit, right? We'll study together. You've got this." Marcus nodded, trying to smile, but the weight of the upcoming test loomed over him like a dark cloud. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time he got home, Marcus was feeling overwhelmed. The idea of revisiting everything, especially the complex equations he had struggled with, seemed like an insurmountable task. It wasn't just the math. It was the pressure, the self-doubt that threatened to rise up again, like a constant companion. At home, his mom was busy in the kitchen when he walked in, but she immediately noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah. Mr. Kavanaugh just announced a huge test for next week. It's going to be all the stuff we've learned so far. I don't know if I'm ready for it." His mom looked at him for a moment, her eyes full of understanding. "I know it seems overwhelming, but you've been working hard, Marcus. You've learned a lot, and you're capable of more than you think." Marcus shook his head. "But what if I mess up? What if all this effort is for nothing?" His mom set down the spoon she'd been stirring with and walked over to him. Listen to me, baby, she said, taking his hands in hers. You can't control everything. What you can control is how you respond. You've already proven to yourself that you can make progress. This test isn't going to define you. It's just another step. Marcus tried to smile, but the doubt was still there. He wanted to believe her, but the fear of failure loomed large. I'll help you, she added, sensing his hesitation. We'll break it down together. Little by little. One equation at a time. His mom's words gave him a small sense of comfort, but the anxiety remained. How could he ever learn everything he needed in time? The next few days were a blur of late-night study sessions. Marcus and Jasmine met in the library after school, poring over notes, practicing problems, and trying to make sense of everything. They had their moments of frustration, especially when the equations seemed to mock them at every turn, but they stuck with it. For the first time, Marcus found that breaking things down into manageable steps actually helped. Instead of focusing on how much he still had to learn, he concentrated on mastering small chunks of the material. He'd work through a few problems, take a break, then return for another round. With Jasmine's steady support, he was starting to feel more confident, even if the test was still looming large in his mind. But no matter how much he studied, the pressure never seemed to ease. He could feel his nerves tightening as the days passed. His mind kept returning to the idea of the test and all the things that could go wrong. Could he really pull this off? On Thursday, just 2 days before the test, Marcus stayed after class to ask Mr. Kavanaugh a question about one of the more difficult problems. The teacher was grading papers when Marcus approached his desk. Mr. Kavanaugh, do you have a minute? Marcus asked, his voice tentative. Mr. Kavanaugh glanced up and nodded. Sure, Marcus. What's on your mind? I'm really struggling with some of these equations, and I was hoping you could help me understand a couple of things. Mr. Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. All right. Let's take a look. Marcus pulled out his notebook and pointed to a problem that had been giving him trouble. Mr. Kavanaugh studied the equation for a moment, then began explaining it step by step. This one's tricky because it combines different concepts, Mr. Kavanaugh said, his voice patient. But if you break it down, it's not as difficult as it looks. As Mr. Kavanaugh walked him through the steps, something clicked in Marcus's mind. The fog of confusion that had clouded his thinking started to lift, and he could see how the pieces fit together. See? Mr. Kavanaugh said, offering a small smile. You've got it. Now try applying this approach to the other problems. Marcus felt a surge of relief, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could do this. He wasn't going to get everything perfect, but he could understand the material. And that was enough. As he packed up to leave, Mr. Kavanaugh called after him, his voice softer than usual. You've come a long way, Marcus. Don't let a test make you second-guess yourself. You're capable of more than you think. Those words stuck with Marcus as he left the classroom, the weight of the upcoming test not feeling quite as heavy. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this. Friday night, Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by textbooks and notes, reviewing the material one last time. Jasmine had checked in earlier, and he'd told her he was feeling better about the test. But inside, his nerves still buzzed like a swarm of bees. He knew there was still a chance he could fail. But after everything he had worked through, the struggles, the breakthroughs, and the support from his mom and friends, he felt ready. Maybe he didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew he wasn't going to let this test define him. As he turned off the desk lamp and headed to bed, he whispered to himself, one equation at a time. The journey was far from over, but it was no longer impossible. The morning of the test arrived with a cloud of anxiety hanging over Marcus. The air felt thicker than usual, as though the weight of the entire semester was riding on this one test. Even the sunlight filtering through the windows felt distant, as if the world outside didn't quite match the intensity of the pressure Marcus was feeling inside. He sat at his desk, staring at his notes for the last time before heading to school. His mom had made him a big breakfast, her way of trying to ease his nerves, but he barely touched it. The nervous energy was overwhelming. "You've got this," she said, giving him a quick hug before he left. "Just do your best, and remember what we talked about. You've made so much progress." "Thanks, Mom," Marcus said quietly, though a knot of doubt still twisted in his stomach. When he arrived at school, the usual buzz of activity around the building felt muted. Most students seemed to be just as anxious as he was. The thought of walking into Mr. Kavanaugh's classroom, where the test would take place, made his palms sweat. As the bell rang, Marcus walked to the classroom, his thoughts racing. He caught a glimpse of Jasmine on the way in, giving him a reassuring thumbs up. She had been his constant support over the past week, helping him with practice problems, encouraging him when things felt impossible. He could feel her support even from across the room. Once inside, Marcus took a deep breath as he sat down at his desk. Mr. Kavanaugh walked around, passing out the test papers, his usual strict expression on his face. The moment he placed the paper on Marcus's desk, it felt like the world stood still. Marcus stared at the first question, his mind momentarily blank. The equations on the page seemed to blur together, each one more complicated than the last. He could hear the sound of pencils scratching against paper, the low hum of other students trying to focus. But for a few seconds, Marcus couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming pressure. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of everything he'd learned over the past few days. He wasn't perfect, but he had put in the work. One equation at a time. Slowly, Marcus began reading the first question again. He started by breaking it down, just like his mom had taught him. He worked through the steps, focused on one part at a time, and before he knew it, the first problem was solved. The relief was almost tangible. He moved on to the next question, and the next. The more he focused on the process, the more confident he became. The doubts, which had clouded his mind earlier, began to fade. Slowly, his pace picked up, and he started to feel a sense of rhythm. But just when he thought he had a handle on things, a particularly difficult problem caught him off guard. He stared at the question, trying to make sense of it, but it felt like the words were dancing around on the page. A few students in the room began to shift in their seats, clearly struggling with the same issue. Marcus's mind raced. He could feel the panic bubbling up inside him, the old self-doubt creeping in. What if he couldn't solve this one? What if this was the question that ruined everything? He glanced over at Jasmine. She was focused on her own paper, but the slight nod she gave him as she caught his eye reminded him to stay calm. One step at a time. Marcus took a deep breath and returned to the problem. He read it again, slower this time, and broke it down into smaller steps. After a few tense moments, the answer started to take shape. He wrote it down, double-checking the calculations before moving on. As the test continued, Marcus found a groove. There were still moments of uncertainty, and he had to remind himself to stay focused, but the overwhelming pressure he'd felt at the start had lifted. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the test, Marcus felt exhausted but proud of himself. He had given it his best shot. The following days dragged by. Marcus spent the weekend distracted, unable to focus on anything else. Every time he thought about the test, the questions he had second-guessed, and the mistakes he had feared he might have made, his stomach twisted in knots. He tried to push those thoughts aside, but it wasn't easy. The anticipation of waiting for the results gnawed at him. Even though his mom and Jasmine both reassured him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was riding on this test. He had worked so hard. Would it be enough? By Monday, Marcus felt like he was walking around in a fog. The constant worry about the test results had worn him thin. As soon as he walked into Mr. Kavanaugh's class, he could see the papers on his desk, those dreaded graded tests, stacked in neat piles. His heart raced as Mr. Kavanaugh began passing the tests back. When his paper finally landed on his desk, Marcus's hands trembled as he unfolded it. He stared at the grade, his breath catching in his throat. A 90%. The numbers didn't seem real at first. He scanned the paper, looking for any mistakes, but everything was marked correctly. The feeling that washed over him was a strange mix of disbelief and relief. For the first time in weeks, Marcus could breathe again. The room around him seemed to fade away as he absorbed the result. He had done it. He had passed the test, and more importantly, he had proven to himself that all the hard work had paid off. Jasmine, sitting across the room, caught his eye. Her face broke into a grin as she saw the expression on his face. Marcus gave her a silent thumbs up, and she responded with a wave. Mr. Kavanaugh stood at the front of the room, surveying his students. "Well done, everyone. You all put in the work, and it shows. Remember, this is just one test, but it's a step forward. Keep it up." Marcus felt a strange sense of pride well up inside him. He had made it through one of the hardest challenges he'd ever faced, and he had come out stronger for it. But more than that, he had realized something important: the journey wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about learning to push through, to keep going even when the odds seemed stacked against him. He wasn't just surviving the challenges, he was starting to thrive. That afternoon, Marcus walked home with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. The weight that had hung over him for so long had finally lifted, and for the first time in a while, he felt like he could breathe. As he entered his house, his mom was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of her. When she saw him, she smiled. "Well?" she asked, her voice full of anticipation. Marcus grinned, holding up the test paper. "I did it, Mom. A 90%. Her eyes lit up with pride. "I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you, Marcus. All your hard work paid off." He sank into the chair next to her, his heart full. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." It wasn't just the grade that mattered, it was everything he had learned along the way. He had found a new confidence in himself, and for the first time in a long while, he knew he was capable of handling whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of accomplishment after receiving his test results. The weight that had burdened him for weeks had lifted, and for the first time in a long while, he could look ahead with a sense of clarity. But life, as always, had other plans. As the days passed, Marcus found himself growing more comfortable with the material, more confident in his abilities. He started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had a place in Mr. Kavanaugh's class after all. But then, just when he felt like he could breathe again, another challenge emerged. It was Tuesday morning when Mr. Kavanaugh dropped the bombshell. "I hope you all enjoyed your break from assessments," Mr. Kavanaugh said with an unsettling calm, his gaze sweeping over the class. "But we're not slowing down just yet. This Friday, I'm assigning a group project. Each group will present a detailed solution to a complex word problem, something we'll be tackling together. Your grade will be based on both your individual contribution and how well your group collaborates." Marcus's stomach churned. A group project? At first, the idea seemed innocuous enough. But then it hit him: group projects were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they meant he didn't have to carry the burden of the work alone. On the other hand, group projects came with their own set of challenges: navigating personalities, splitting up the work fairly, and dealing with the inevitable tension that arose when one person didn't pull their weight. His mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. What if his group wasn't a good fit? What if the other students didn't take the project seriously? What if, despite everything he'd accomplished, he ended up letting the team down? Jasmine noticed the sudden shift in Marcus's expression as Mr. Kavanaugh continued explaining the project. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Marcus nodded, trying to hide his anxiety. Yeah, just thinking about the project. I don't know if I'm good at working with others like that. Jasmine smiled, nudging him lightly. You're great with numbers, Marcus. You just have to trust yourself, and trust your team. But Marcus's mind was already racing. There were so many variables. Would his teammates be as committed as he was? Would they even be willing to put in the effort? Mr. Kavanaugh wrapped up the announcement, and Marcus found himself reluctantly looking around the room, waiting to see who his groupmates would be. To his surprise, when Mr. Kavanaugh called out the names, Marcus's group was made up of a mix of familiar faces, Jasmine, of course, who he trusted, but also Mike and Ella, two students Marcus had never really interacted with much before. Mike was a quiet guy, always keeping to himself, and Ella was known for being a bit of a perfectionist. She had a reputation for getting things done, but at times, her high standards made her come across as harsh or impatient with others. The thought of working with her made Marcus uneasy, as he wasn't sure how he'd mesh with her demanding attitude. Jasmine seemed to sense Marcus's discomfort and leaned in to offer him a reassuring smile. We'll be fine. I'm sure Mike and Ella are more capable than we think. We just have to divide the work and communicate. Marcus wasn't so sure. The next few days were a blur of awkward group meetings and tentative planning. Jasmine, true to her word, took the lead in organizing the group. She divided up the tasks, ensuring that each person had a clear role. Marcus was assigned to work on the calculations, which was a relief, as numbers felt like his stronghold. But Ella's presence loomed large during every meeting. She was efficient, but she often took charge in a way that made Marcus feel sidelined. At one point, during a particularly tense discussion about how to approach one of the problems, Ella snapped at Mike when he suggested an alternative method. No, Mike, that's not how you solve it. You're overcomplicating it, she said, her tone sharp. Mike looked taken aback, but he didn't argue. Marcus felt uncomfortable, unsure of how to navigate the tension building between Ella and Mike. Was it just his perception, or was Ella making everything harder than it needed to be? During their next meeting, Marcus decided to speak up. Ella, he started, hesitating. I think we need to be open to other ideas. Mike has a point, and we could look at things from a different angle. Ella's eyes narrowed, but instead of dismissing him outright, she paused. After a long moment, she nodded reluctantly. Fine. Let's try it your way, then. To his surprise, it worked. The alternative approach actually simplified the problem, and Marcus found himself gaining a bit more confidence in his ability to contribute, even in a group setting. Slowly but surely, the project began to take shape. But just as things seemed to be moving forward, Mike began to withdraw. He stopped coming to meetings, and when he did show up, he seemed distracted and disinterested. At one point, Jasmine tried to approach him after class. Mike, we really need you to step up. We can't finish this project without everyone pulling their weight, she said, her voice firm but kind. Mike sighed, rubbing his forehead. I know. I don't know if I can keep up. I'm just not good at this stuff. Jasmine's expression softened. Look, we've all struggled. But we're a team, Mike. You're not alone in this. We'll work through it together. Mike's face remained downcast, but he nodded. I'll try harder. I promise. As the week dragged on, the pressure mounted. The project was due on Friday, and while Marcus felt like they had made progress, something didn't sit right. They still hadn't nailed down all the details, and time was running out. He could feel the weight of the approaching deadline pressing down on him. In one of their final meetings, just 2 days before the presentation, Ella's frustration reached its peak. We're running out of time. This is a mess. How are we supposed to finish this on time if no one can stay focused? She snapped. Marcus felt a spark of anger rise within him. He understood her frustration, but her attitude wasn't helping. He stood up, trying to remain calm. Ella, we're all doing our best. Yelling at everyone isn't going to fix anything. Let's just focus on what's left to do and get it done together. Ella was taken aback by his outburst, but after a long pause, she exhaled and nodded. I'm sorry. I just want it to be perfect. Marcus sat back down, his heart racing. I know. But we don't have to be perfect. We just need to do our best. The day of the presentation arrived with a sense of unease hanging in the air. Marcus's stomach was in knots, not just because of the project, but because of everything that had happened in the days leading up to it. Would they be able to pull it off? Would they finish on time? Would they get the grade they deserved? As Marcus walked into Mr. Kavanaugh's classroom, he glanced over at his group. They were all tense, but they were there, together. No matter what happened, Marcus knew one thing for certain: they had worked hard, and they had learned a lot about what it meant to rely on others. The air in the classroom was thick with tension. Marcus could hear the soft shuffle of students' feet and the nervous murmurs of groups whispering to each other. It was the morning of the group project presentations, and the clock was ticking down to the moment of truth. In just an hour, Marcus and his team would step up in front of Mr. Kavanaugh and the rest of the class and present their work, a culmination of days of stress, disagreement, and some small victories. As they took their seats, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The room seemed colder than usual, as if the weight of the upcoming presentations was somehow controlling the temperature. He could hear the faint hum of a projector being set up at the front of the room, a reminder of the inevitable spotlight that awaited each group. Jasmine leaned over to Marcus and whispered, "We've got this. We've worked hard. Just focus on what we know." Marcus nodded, but the fluttering of nerves in his stomach remained. The tension in their group was palpable. They had overcome disagreements and moments of frustration, but there was still a lingering uncertainty about how it would all come together. Would Mike hold it together? Would Ella manage to keep her cool? And would they, as a team, be able to present smoothly under the pressure? As Mr. Kavanaugh called the first group to present, the knot in Marcus's stomach tightened. It was go time. The first group stepped forward and began their presentation, their voices shaking slightly but growing steadier as they delved into their problem-solving process. Marcus listened, trying to gauge the level of difficulty they were tackling and comparing it to his own team's work. Theirs seemed decent, but there were some rough edges. He could do this. They could do this. Finally, it was their turn. Jasmine stood first, confidently taking the microphone as she began to speak. Good morning, everyone. We're going to walk you through the process we followed to solve this complex word problem and the steps we used to ensure our solution was accurate. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing away the rising anxiety. His heart was pounding in his chest, but as he looked at Jasmine, who had always been the calm one in their group, he reminded himself that he was not in this alone. Jasmine introduced each part of the problem, and as she outlined the approach, Marcus felt his nerves begin to ease. He could see Ella and Mike working quietly in the background, adjusting slides and checking their calculations. Everyone was in sync, and for the first time, it felt like they were a true team. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood up, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks as he adjusted his glasses. His hands felt clammy, but he was determined not to show it. He stepped forward, a little too quickly, and cleared his throat. We approached the equation step by step, starting with isolating the variable, Marcus said, his voice wavering slightly at first. Then, we used substitution to simplify the process. As he explained the math behind their solution, Marcus found his rhythm. He spoke a little faster than he intended, but the words came easier as he moved through the steps. He could see his teammates nodding in approval, and Mike even gave him a small thumbs up, which helped to ease his nerves. He wrapped up his portion of the presentation, passing the mic to Ella, who was the most meticulous when it came to ensuring the final answer was verified and explained thoroughly. Ella stood, her back straight, as she took over. Once we had completed the calculations, we verified our solution by checking the result against the original equation. We also ensured that the units were consistent and that the final answer made logical sense within the context of the problem. Her voice was confident, but Marcus could see the slight edge of tension in her posture. Ella had a habit of wanting things to be perfect, and although she was technically brilliant, her perfectionism sometimes made her anxious in front of others. She finished her part, and with a deep breath, the group collectively exhaled. The presentation was over. As they returned to their seats, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. The hardest part was behind them, and now all they could do was wait for feedback. Mr. Kavanaugh stood and clapped slowly. "Well done, team. I can tell you all put in a lot of effort into this project. I'm impressed by how you work together, despite some of the obvious challenges." Marcus exchanged a quick glance with his teammates. That was a compliment they hadn't expected. Mr. Kavanaugh continued, "There's always room for improvement, of course. The logic behind your approach was sound, but I'd recommend paying a bit more attention to the clarity of your explanations. Some parts of your solution could have been explained more clearly for the audience to follow. And, Ella, great job verifying the solution. But maybe try to avoid being too perfectionist in your presentation. Remember, confidence in delivery can be just as important as the math itself." Ella looked down, a small flush of embarrassment on her face, but Marcus could see she was taking the feedback to heart. "I'll work on that next time," Ella muttered, her voice quiet but thoughtful. Mr. Kavanaugh nodded. "Good. Now, overall, a solid effort. I'll be grading this over the next few days, but you've earned a strong grade for your work in collaboration. Keep it up." The class erupted into applause, and Marcus felt a rush of relief and pride. They had done it. They had gotten through the presentation, and the feedback was constructive, not harsh. They could move forward without carrying the weight of this project on their shoulders any longer. As the class came to an end, Marcus and his group lingered near the door, chatting in low voices. "Honestly, I didn't think we were going to pull it off," Mike said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But we did it. Thanks, everyone." Jasmine smiled at him. "Told you. When we all work together, we can accomplish anything." Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This experience, this moment, was so much more than just a project. It was about overcoming their differences, learning to communicate, and, above all, trusting each other. The journey had not been without its bumps, but it had been worth it. "Good job, Marcus," Ella said as she caught his eye. "You really stepped up. I'm impressed." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thanks, Ella. You did great too." The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and Marcus stepped out of the room, his heart light. As he walked down the hall, he felt something shift inside him, a renewed sense of confidence. The lesson he'd learned through this project was clear: sometimes, the most difficult challenges weren't just about the work at hand but about learning to trust others and trust yourself. It was about growth, and Marcus knew that this project was only one of many steps forward. The road ahead would have more obstacles, more moments of doubt, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus believed that he could handle them. The euphoria from the group project presentation slowly began to fade as Marcus walked out of Mr. Kavanaugh's classroom. It had been a victory, yes, but it also felt like a brief, shining moment before the world, once again, threw new challenges at him. For the first time in a while, Marcus allowed himself to feel proud of his work. His efforts had paid off, and for that, he was grateful. But just as his confidence was beginning to build, something unexpected came up. The next round of exams was looming on the horizon, and this time, it was going to be harder. That evening, Marcus sat in his room, surrounded by textbooks and notes. The deadlines for the next exams were fast approaching, and despite his success in the group project, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of anxiety. He had worked so hard to get through the project, but now he faced the next mountain to climb, an even bigger one than before. The thought of facing another round of rigorous tests made his stomach churn. His mind, which had once been so focused on equations and problem-solving, was now spinning with the pressure of performing well and maintaining the momentum he'd fought so hard to build. "I can do this," Marcus muttered to himself, gripping his pencil tighter. He started to review his notes again, reading through the equations and theories he had learned over the past few weeks. The pressure was mounting, but he couldn't afford to lose focus now. Not after everything he'd been through. But his confidence faltered when his phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Jasmine: "Study session at my place tonight, if you're interested. Mike and Ella will be there." It was tempting. Maybe a study session would ease the stress. But then again, Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready to face the pressure of having everyone around him again. He'd done well in the group project, but studying for exams felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. Everyone around him seemed to grasp things so easily, while he felt like he was constantly playing catch-up. His phone buzzed again. "Jasmine, come on, we'll work through the toughest stuff. It'll be fun. We've got this." Marcus couldn't deny that Jasmine's optimism was infectious. She had a way of making things seem less daunting, and maybe, just maybe, working together might make this next hurdle easier to face. With a sigh, he replied, "Okay. I'll be there in an hour." When Marcus arrived at Jasmine's house, he was greeted by the familiar sight of her front door, which always seemed to have a welcoming vibe, even in the midst of the chaos of their studies. Inside, Mike and Ella were already there, seated at the dining table, textbooks spread across the surface. Ella looked up as Marcus entered, offering a quick smile. "Hey, you made it. We're just about to dive into the most difficult section. Ready to tackle it?" Marcus nodded, forcing a smile despite the nerves swirling inside him. "Yeah, let's do this." As they gathered around the table, the mood was more focused than he expected. Jasmine quickly took charge of organizing the study session, handing out practice problems and guiding everyone through the concepts. She had a natural ability to make complex things seem simple, breaking everything down in a way that made sense. But Marcus couldn't shake his growing unease. It wasn't that the others weren't helping, quite the opposite, actually. But every time he glanced at Ella or Mike, he felt this subtle pressure to keep up, to be as fast as they were at solving the problems. Mike, who had started out shy and reserved, was becoming more engaged in the process, offering suggestions and collaborating more fluidly. Ella, despite her occasional perfectionist tendencies, was calm and steady, solving problems with ease. Marcus, on the other hand, was struggling. His mind seemed to freeze up as he worked through a particularly tricky problem. The numbers blurred on the page, and the steps to solve the equation felt like they were slipping out of his grasp. Jasmine noticed his hesitation. "Marcus, are you okay? You're looking a little off." Marcus forced a chuckle, trying to cover up his frustration. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just need a second." Ella, who had been quietly observing him, raised an eyebrow. "If you're having trouble, it might help to break it down into smaller parts. You've been doing fine with the smaller problems. This one just has more steps." Her voice, while still firm, was kinder than Marcus expected. Ella's tendency to be blunt had often made him feel like she was judging him, but right now, there was no judgment, only genuine help. He nodded, taking a deep breath and focusing on the problem again. Ella's suggestion worked. Slowly but surely, the numbers started to make sense again. "Thanks, Ella," he said, offering a small but sincere smile. "No problem. We're all in this together," she replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Hours passed, and though the study session was grueling, something had changed. Marcus felt more at ease with his group. They worked together seamlessly, and despite the intense focus, there were moments of lightheartedness, shared jokes and small victories over difficult problems. It was, for the first time, a productive but relaxed environment. As the session drew to a close, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, stretching. I think we've covered everything we need. We'll go over the last few things tomorrow, but I'm feeling pretty good about all of this. Marcus stretched as well, rubbing his eyes. Yeah, me too. This helped a lot. I wasn't sure at first, but I think we're really getting it. Mike smiled at him. Told you we'd make a good team. It's not just about getting the answers, it's about understanding the process. Ella nodded, a rare softness in her expression. Exactly. And you did a great job, Marcus. I think you're really starting to get the hang of this. For the first time, Marcus truly felt like he was a part of the group, not just someone who was trying to keep up, but someone who was contributing. The weight of the pressure had lessened just a little, and he felt more prepared for the exam ahead. As he left Jasmine's house that night, Marcus felt the warmth of the study session linger in his chest. He still didn't know if he was ready for the exams, but he knew one thing for sure, he was no longer facing it alone. His team had his back. The road ahead would still be challenging. There would be moments of doubt, more obstacles to face. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he could handle whatever came his way. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer controlled him. As he made his way home, Marcus made a silent promise to himself, he was going to face the next challenge head-on, and this time, he wasn't going to let anything hold him back. The morning of the exam arrived faster than Marcus anticipated, and the reality of it hit him like a ton of bricks. The sun had barely risen, casting a muted glow through his bedroom window, but Marcus had been awake for hours. His mind had been racing since the moment his alarm clock went off. Despite all the studying the night before, a deep, unshakable sense of dread lingered in the pit of his stomach. The exam would cover everything they'd learned over the last few weeks, from the most basic concepts to the most complex equations. The pressure was mounting. He had worked hard, but was it enough? Was he really ready? He took a deep breath and looked at his reflection in the mirror. He didn't recognize the person staring back at him. The sleep-deprived eyes and disheveled hair reflected the anxiety he'd been trying to push aside for weeks. He hadn't been able to get the image of the exam, the terrifying set of questions that awaited him, out of his head. But then he remembered the study session the night before. The support from his group, Jasmine, Mike, and Ella. They had all been there for him. He had to trust that he wasn't alone in this. He couldn't let fear hold him back. When Marcus arrived at school, the atmosphere felt different. The usual buzz of students between classes was replaced with an intense undercurrent of tension. It wasn't just Marcus who was feeling the weight of the upcoming exam, everyone around him seemed to be carrying the same burden. He passed by his classmates in the hallway, and their faces were all clouded with the same nervous energy. Marcus spotted Jasmine at her locker and immediately walked over to her. "Hey, you ready for this?" Marcus asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Jasmine flashed him a reassuring smile, though Marcus could tell her nerves were still there too. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be. But don't worry, we've got this. We've been preparing for this, remember?" Marcus nodded, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. "Yeah, I know. It feels different when the exam is actually here." "I get it," Jasmine replied, closing her locker. "But we've been working together for weeks now. No matter what, we've done everything we could. And we can always learn from this, too. This is just one challenge. There's more to come, and we'll handle them the same way." Her words were comforting, but the unease still lingered. Marcus smiled weakly. "Thanks, Jasmine. I just keep thinking I might forget everything." "You won't," she assured him. "You've got this." As the bell rang, signaling the start of the exam, Marcus walked into the classroom, his palms slightly damp with sweat. He took a deep breath and sat at his desk, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. His teammates were scattered around the room, all immersed in their own pre-exam rituals. Jasmine was scribbling notes to herself, Mike was flipping through a last-minute review sheet, and Ella sat with her eyes closed, probably mentally preparing herself. Marcus glanced at the clock. There was only a minute left before they were allowed to begin. He set his pencil down, breathing in deeply to try to steady himself. He didn't want his nerves to get the best of him, not after everything he had been through to get here. The moment the clock struck the hour, Mr. Kavanaugh spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "All right, everyone. You have 2 hours to complete this exam. Remember to pace yourselves and read each question carefully. Do your best, and don't rush. Begin." Marcus immediately glanced at the first question, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a word problem, exactly the kind of question that had tripped him up in the past. He read it over and over, his mind racing to process the information. His hand hovered over the paper, unsure where to start. He took a deep breath, just like Jasmine had told him to do. Break it down, he thought. Start with what you know. He picked up his pencil and began to sketch out the equation, taking it step by step. Slowly, the numbers started to make sense, and the panic inside him started to dissipate. The longer he focused, the clearer the solution became. He wasn't rushing, he was thinking, carefully and methodically. By the time he moved on to the next question, he was starting to feel a sense of rhythm. The fear that had held him captive at the start of the exam was beginning to fade, replaced with a growing sense of control. Every equation felt a little more familiar now. The fear of failure wasn't gone, but it was no longer in the driver's seat. As the exam neared its halfway point, Marcus glanced over at Jasmine. She caught his eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up. She was working at a steady pace, and her confidence was contagious. Mike, too, seemed absorbed in his work, his pen moving fluidly across the paper. Even Ella, who had been nervous during the study session, seemed to have found her stride, her eyes focused and unblinking. The room was quiet except for the sound of pencils scratching across paper. The tension was still there, but now it felt manageable. The panic had been replaced by purpose. Marcus looked up again as the clock ticked down to the final 20 minutes. His mind was starting to feel the strain of the 2-hour exam, but there was a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over him. He had made it this far, and he was almost done. He glanced over at the final question, a tricky, multi-step problem that had him stumped during the study session. His heart sank for a moment, but then he reminded himself, "I've got this. Just breathe and think it through." With a steady hand, he began to work through the steps, taking his time. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solid answer. It was good enough. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the exam, Marcus sat back in his chair, feeling an odd mix of exhaustion and relief. His hands were tired from gripping the pencil so tightly, but his mind was clear. He had done everything he could. Mr. Kavanaugh collected the papers, and Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The exam was over. There was nothing more he could do now except wait. As he walked out of the classroom, he met up with Jasmine, Mike, and Ella. They all looked equally exhausted but relieved. "How do you feel?" Jasmine asked, her eyes searching his face. Marcus shrugged, trying to keep his emotions in check. "It wasn't easy, but I think I did all right. Better than I expected, at least." "I think we all did well," Mike said with a grin. "It's over now. No more stressing." Ella nodded. "We handled it together. That's what counts." Marcus couldn't help but smile. They had done it. They had faced the challenge together, and though the journey had been difficult, they had made it through. As they walked to the cafeteria together, Marcus realized something important. No matter what the results of the exam would be, he had learned a valuable lesson. It wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience. It was about pushing through the fear and working together, even when the road seemed impossible. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. It was the day after the exam, and Marcus sat in his usual seat in the cafeteria, picking at his food but not really eating. The wait for the exam results was driving him crazy. The tension that had slowly started to dissipate in the days leading up to the exam had returned with a vengeance. The dread of not knowing how he had done was gnawing at him. He tried to focus on his lunch, but his mind kept drifting back to the exam. Had he answered everything correctly? Had he missed an important step in one of the equations? What if his mind had blanked out during the final problem, the one that had tripped him up during the study session? "Hey, Earth to Marcus." Jasmine's voice broke through his thoughts. She slid into the seat across from him, offering a grin. "You're looking like you're about to eat that pencil instead of your lunch." Marcus forced a smile. "I'm just thinking about the exam. I keep wondering how I did." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "I get it. I was the same way. But hey, the results won't be in until later today, so there's no point stressing now. We did the best we could." "Yeah, you're right," Marcus said, sighing. He poked at his fries absently. "Still, it feels like it's been forever. I keep imagining worst-case scenarios." Jasmine smiled knowingly. "That's your brain trying to trick you into panicking. You know, you really have come a long way since the first day. You've been putting in the work, there's no reason why you won't do great." His mind momentarily shifted to their study sessions, the late nights, and how everyone had come together, helping each other out when things got tough. Jasmine was right, he had come a long way, and perhaps he should give himself more credit for that. But then, the bell rang, and Marcus couldn't help but feel that all too familiar sense of nervousness creep back into his chest. The next class was math, and that was where they would get their exam results. As Marcus sat in math class, his heart hammered in his chest. The thought of seeing his grade on that paper felt like a cruel punishment. He was both terrified and desperate to know. His palms were clammy as he tried to focus on the lecture, but all he could think about was when Mr. Kavanaugh would finally hand out the graded exams. Jasmine, who sat beside him, must have sensed his nerves. She leaned over and whispered, "You've got this, Marcus. Whatever happens, you did your best." He gave her a tight smile. "Thanks. I really hope you're right." And then, like a cruel joke, Mr. Kavanaugh walked into the room, holding a stack of exams. He placed them on his desk, and the sound of papers shuffling was like a drumbeat in Marcus's ears. He could already feel the weight of the paper in his hands, even though he hadn't received it yet. Mr. Kavanaugh cleared his throat and addressed the class. "All right, everyone, I'll be handing out the exams now. When you get yours back, take a moment to review it. We'll discuss any questions you may have afterward." One by one, Mr. Kavanaugh passed out the exams, his eyes scanning the room. Marcus's heart raced. He could hear his own breathing, each inhale and exhale too loud in his ears. Finally, Mr. Kavanaugh walked toward him, a thick exam paper in hand. He placed it on Marcus's desk, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt quieter than usual as Marcus stared at the paper, the weight of it nearly suffocating him. "Good luck," Mr. Kavanaugh said with a quiet nod, and moved on to the next student. Marcus took a deep breath, turning the paper over to face the grade. The red pen was the first thing he saw. His stomach lurched. But then, his eyes widened as he took in the grade at the top of the page. It wasn't a perfect score, but it was better than he had hoped for. Much better. A solid B+. It wasn't the A he had dreamed of, but it was an incredible improvement from where he had started. His heart swelled with relief, and for the first time in a while, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Jasmine leaned over, her voice low. "How'd you do?" Marcus's smile spread across his face before he could stop it. B+. "That's awesome. You totally nailed it." He couldn't contain the grin that spread across his face. "I actually did better than I thought I would. I thought I was going to bomb it." See? I told you, all that hard work paid off, she said, giving him a playful nudge. You've earned it. The rest of the class passed by in a blur. Marcus could hardly focus, his mind still on his grade. The mix of excitement and disbelief was almost too much to handle. He had worked so hard for this moment, and it felt surreal to finally see the results of his efforts. It was a sign that all the hours of studying, the sleepless nights, the stress, and the doubts had been worth it. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, Marcus quickly gathered his things. He wanted to find Mike and Ella, to share his results with them and celebrate. As he walked out of the classroom, he spotted them in the hallway. Hey, guys. I got a B+. Marcus practically beamed. Mike grinned at him. I knew you had it in you, man. You did awesome. Ella smiled warmly, her usual composure giving way to a rare softness. You worked hard for it. You deserve it. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he was truly part of something, part of a team, part of a group that supported each other through thick and thin. As they made their way to the lockers, Marcus's mind wandered again, but this time, it wasn't filled with doubt or fear. Instead, he thought about how far he had come. He had faced his fear of failure, and now, he was learning to embrace the idea of success. His journey wasn't over, but the result of that exam, the validation of his hard work, felt like a turning point. That evening, Marcus sat down at his desk and opened his math textbook again, but this time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt ready for whatever came next. He was no longer just the student who barely kept up. He was the student who had fought hard for his success, the student who had learned that effort and resilience mattered more than anything else. And that, Marcus thought, was just the beginning. The week after the exam, Marcus found himself walking with a new sense of confidence. His B+ was no longer just a letter on a piece of paper. It was a symbol of something bigger, a representation of everything he had worked for, everything he had overcome. The praise from his friends, from Jasmine, Mike, and Ella, only made it feel more real. But there was still a part of him that wondered whether he could keep this momentum going. Could he continue to rise above the doubts that had once held him back? Or was this success just a fleeting moment, soon to be overshadowed by another challenge he'd have to face? It was a Saturday morning when Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his phone. He had gotten a text from Mr. Kavanaugh, the math teacher. It was a message that would change everything. Marcus, I'd like to see you after school on Monday. Please come by my office. I'd like to talk to you about your performance. Marcus stared at the text for a long moment, feeling his stomach churn with a sudden wave of nervousness. The message had an air of formality about it, almost like a professor calling a student into their office. Was he in trouble? Had he missed something in the exam? He couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety that crept up. He wanted to overthink it, to imagine every possible reason why Mr. Kavanaugh would want to meet with him, but he forced himself to stop. He needed to focus on the fact that he had done well, he had earned that B+. And no matter what Monday's meeting was about, he could handle it. Monday arrived quicker than expected. The entire weekend had been a blur, his mind bouncing from thoughts of the meeting with Mr. Kavanaugh to his progress in the class. But he pushed those thoughts aside as he walked through the halls, determined not to let fear take over again. When the bell rang, signaling the start of the final class of the day, Marcus found himself growing more anxious. He kept glancing at the clock as time seemed to drag. After what felt like an eternity, the final bell rang, and his stomach did a flip. He made his way to Mr. Kavanaugh's office, his steps hesitant but determined. As he reached the door, he took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," came Mr. Kavanaugh's voice from the other side. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the small office, greeted by the familiar scent of old books and coffee. Mr. Kavanaugh was sitting at his desk, a stack of papers in front of him, and he motioned for Marcus to take a seat. "Sit down, Marcus," Mr. Kavanaugh said with a calm smile. "I'm glad you came by. Marcus sat down, his nerves still tight. You wanted to see me about the exam? Mr. Kavanaugh nodded. Yes, but not for the reason you might think. I wanted to talk to you about your progress in this class. You've been doing really well lately. I've noticed a significant improvement, not just in your grades, but in your approach to learning. You've really come a long way. Marcus blinked in surprise. Really? Mr. Kavanaugh chuckled. Really? I've been teaching for a long time, and I can tell when a student is putting in the effort, even if it doesn't show immediately. You've grown so much, Marcus. I've seen you transform from someone who doubted his abilities to someone who's truly capable of understanding this material. Marcus felt a flush of pride spread across his face. He hadn't realized how much he had changed, but hearing it from someone else made him realize just how far he'd come. You've got a lot of potential, Mr. Kavanaugh continued. And I'm not the only one who's noticed. I think you should start thinking about challenging yourself more. You're ready for more advanced work, and I believe you could really excel if you push yourself. The words hit Marcus like a wave. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Challenging himself more. Advanced work? I don't know, Marcus said, his voice low. I mean, I'm happy with where I'm at now. I didn't even think I'd be able to get a B+ on the exam. I don't know if I'm ready for anything more. Mr. Kavanaugh leaned forward, his eyes locking with Marcus's. Marcus, you are ready. You've already proved it. The B+ wasn't a fluke. That's the result of hard work and dedication. You've earned it. And you can do even better, if you give yourself the chance. Marcus's heart raced. The words, advanced work, still echoed in his head. It sounded intimidating, but at the same time, it also felt like an opportunity he couldn't ignore. He had never been the type to take risks in school, always playing it safe, staying within his comfort zone. But Mr. Kavanaugh's words were different. They pushed him toward something bigger. Think about it, Mr. Kavanaugh said, seeing the hesitation in Marcus's eyes. You don't have to decide right now. But I want you to know that I believe in you. You've already proven you can succeed. Now, it's about believing in yourself even more. Marcus sat back, letting the words sink in. Could he really do more? Could he challenge himself to be better, to aim higher? For so long, he had doubted his potential. But now, sitting in Mr. Kavanaugh's office, hearing that encouragement, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was time to start taking bigger steps. Okay, Marcus finally said, a tentative but determined smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'll think about it. Mr. Kavanaugh smiled back. Good. I'm glad. You'll have my full support if you decide to take that step. As Marcus left the office, his mind was racing. The idea of challenging himself more, of pushing his boundaries, felt both exciting and terrifying. But as he walked down the hallway, he couldn't help but think that this was exactly what he needed, another challenge, another way to prove to himself that he could do more than he ever imagined. He was no longer just a student passing through school. He was someone capable of growth, of change. And with that realization, he felt a sense of purpose settle deep in his chest. There were still obstacles ahead, challenges that he couldn't predict, but he wasn't afraid of them anymore. He had already come so far. Now, the only thing left to do was keep moving forward. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him after his conversation with Mr. Kavanaugh. The idea of challenging himself more wasn't just a fleeting thought, it lingered in the back of his mind, pulling him forward. On Wednesday, he found himself walking into the library after school, his backpack slung over his shoulder, and a sense of quiet determination in his step. It had been a while since he'd voluntarily gone to the library to study. Usually, it was only when he was behind or struggling, but today was different. He wasn't there because he had to be, he was there because he wanted to be. Jasmine was already sitting at one of the tables, her head buried in a pile of books. She looked up when Marcus walked in. "Hey," she called, her face lighting up as she saw him. "You're here early. What's up?" Marcus sat down across from her, unzipping his bag. "I need to talk to you about something." She raised an eyebrow. "That's serious?" Marcus paused, trying to find the right words. "I'm thinking about taking on more advanced work, pushing myself to do more. Mr. Kavanaugh thinks I'm ready, but I don't know. It feels like a huge step." Jasmine smiled knowingly, tapping her pencil against the table. "I knew you'd get there. You've been putting in the work for so long, Marcus. You're not just ready. You're overdue for a challenge. So, what's holding you back?" He hesitated, glancing at the books on the table. "It's just scary, you know. I've always been the guy who stayed comfortable, who didn't take risks. But now, I'm thinking about stepping up, and it's intimidating." Jasmine's smile softened, and she leaned forward. "Marcus, look at how far you've already come. You used to doubt yourself, right? But now you've shown you can do the work. You didn't get that B+ by playing it safe. So why stop now?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. Marcus had always been a person who played it cautious, who stayed just on the edge of comfort. But Jasmine was right. He had already pushed himself this far. Why shouldn't he go even further? Before he could respond, she added, "Besides, you've got me and Mike to back you up, right? We'll be right here to support you." He felt a rush of gratitude for his friends. They had been with him through every step of this journey. They had been there when he struggled, and they would be there as he took on new challenges. "Yeah," Marcus said, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I guess you're right. I can do this." Jasmine grinned. "That's the spirit. You've got this, Marcus. Let's make a plan. You know you'll need to put in even more hours for the advanced stuff, but it's totally doable. And hey, you'll never know if you don't try." Marcus felt his heart rate slow as the nervousness faded into something else, something more like excitement. He was going to push himself. He was going to take that step forward. The next day, Marcus approached Mr. Kavanaugh after class. He had made his decision. "Mr. Kavanaugh?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. "I think I'm ready to try more advanced work. I want to take that step." Mr. Kavanaugh's face broke into a warm smile. "I'm glad to hear that, Marcus. I've been waiting for you to say that. It's a big decision, and it'll be a lot of work, but I know you can handle it. We'll start slow, with some extra assignments, just to see how you manage, and then we can adjust from there." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. "I'm ready." Mr. Kavanaugh handed him a few advanced problems from the upcoming unit. "Here's a taste of what's to come. Work through these on your own time, and come to me if you get stuck." As Marcus left the classroom, he couldn't shake the excitement bubbling inside him. The work would be harder, no doubt, but it was the challenge he had been craving. He knew there would be times when he would struggle, but that was part of the process. It was all part of growing. The next few weeks flew by, and Marcus dove into his new assignments with a focus he hadn't known he was capable of. He spent long hours in the library, at home, and even after class, tackling problems that made his head spin at first. But with each step, he grew more confident in his ability to handle the complexity. At first, the advanced work was overwhelming. He stumbled through a few problems, got frustrated, and wanted to give up. But every time he felt like he was on the verge of defeat, he reminded himself of the reason he was doing this, to prove to himself that he could. There were nights when he would sit at his desk, staring at the equations on his paper, feeling like they were mocking him. But then, slowly but surely, he started to see the patterns. The problems began to make sense. He wasn't just memorizing formulas anymore, he was understanding the logic behind them. He was learning, not just passing. And every time he got something right, every time a problem clicked into place, he felt a rush of pride. It was no longer about the grade or the test. It was about his own growth, his own journey. One Friday afternoon, just a month after he had decided to take on more advanced work, Marcus sat down with Mr. Kavanagh again. The teacher had asked to meet to discuss his progress. "Well, Marcus," Mr. Kavanagh said, flipping through a stack of papers. "You've been putting in the work, I can see that. And I'm impressed with how much you've improved. Your last assignment was almost flawless. You're doing great." Marcus smiled, but there was a hint of nervousness in his expression. "Thanks, but I'm still not sure I'm fully there yet. Some of the problems still trip me up." Mr. Kavanagh nodded thoughtfully. "That's to be expected. Progress isn't linear. It's okay to struggle, it's part of learning. But you're definitely on the right track." Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep going, keep pushing himself. "You're ready for the next level," Mr. Kavanagh said, his voice full of encouragement. "Keep it up. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Marcus." As Marcus left the teacher's office, the words echoed in his mind. He had come so far. From the student who was terrified of math, to the one who was now conquering advanced problems with determination. It wasn't just about the work, it was about believing in himself, about knowing he had the power to rise above any challenge. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was someone who could take on whatever came his way. And for the first time in a long time, he was excited about what the future held. The following month felt like a blur for Marcus. The more he worked on his advanced math assignments, the more he found himself immersed in a different world, one where each new problem was a puzzle, each new formula was a key to unlocking deeper understanding. His friends noticed the change. Jasmine and Mike, who had seen Marcus struggle before, now saw him light up when he talked about math. He was no longer the same Marcus who once doubted his own abilities, unsure if he could ever make it. No, this version of him was determined, focused, and even more driven than before. But with his newfound confidence came new challenges. The advanced work was hard, sometimes harder than he expected, but he never backed down. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but it was a journey he was willing to take. On the morning of a particularly grueling midterm, Marcus woke up early, his mind already buzzing with equations, formulas, and strategies. The weight of the exam hung over him, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt like he was going into battle alone. He had worked for this. He had earned this. The exam hall was filled with the usual tension as students filed into their seats. Marcus could feel his heart rate pick up, but this time, he wasn't terrified. He wasn't afraid of failing. He had prepared for this moment, put in the work, and now all he had to do was trust himself. He looked around the room, seeing familiar faces, Jasmine, Mike, and others who had all been part of his journey. He felt a sense of camaraderie, knowing that everyone in that room had their own battles to fight. But Marcus didn't feel alone anymore. As the proctor handed out the exams, Marcus took a deep breath and flipped to the first page. The problems were complex, no doubt, but they didn't feel insurmountable. He had tackled worse. He dove in, working through the problems methodically, solving them one by one. Every now and then, his mind would wander to the past, the moments when math had felt impossible, the nights he had stayed up late doubting whether he was good enough. Those days seemed so far away now, almost like a distant memory. He was doing it. He was taking the test like everyone else, but with the knowledge that he was no longer the person he had been when he first started. He had evolved. When the test was finally over, Marcus walked out of the room with a mixture of relief and excitement. He didn't know how well he had done, but for the first time, he wasn't obsessed with the outcome. He had worked hard. He had learned. And that was enough. Over the next few days, as the grades started rolling in, Marcus found himself checking his email more eagerly than usual. The suspense was nerve-wracking, but he didn't let the anxiety take over. After all, the outcome didn't define him anymore. The final notification appeared. The subject line read, "Your midterm grade." He opened the email and scanned the message. There it was, in black and white, a dash. Marcus couldn't contain the grin that spread across his face. It wasn't just the grade itself, it was everything the grade represented. It was proof that he had made it, that all the work, all the late nights, and all the doubt he had faced had paid off. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with Jasmine and Mike at the coffee shop to celebrate. They had been following his progress closely, and when they heard the news, they couldn't have been more thrilled. "You did it!" Jasmine exclaimed, giving him a high five. "I knew you could." Mike was grinning too, his eyes wide with excitement. "You're officially a math genius now. Man, I'm so proud of you." Marcus laughed, feeling a rush of gratitude for his friends. They had been there through every moment, even the times when he wasn't sure he could make it. "It's all thanks to you guys," Marcus said. "I couldn't have done this without the support." But there was more to it than that. It wasn't just about the grades or the recognition. It was about the fact that Marcus had transformed. He had learned to believe in himself, to push through the doubt and uncertainty. He had faced his fears head-on, and in doing so, had proven that he was capable of so much more than he ever imagined. The next few weeks passed in a blur of assignments, tests, and new challenges. But for Marcus, it felt like he was on a steady upward trajectory. He still faced obstacles, there were still moments of frustration and self-doubt, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer the person who let fear hold him back. One afternoon, while he was working on a particularly tough problem, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Kavanaugh. "Marcus, I wanted to let you know that I'm really impressed with your progress. I think it's time for you to join the honors group. You're ready for it." Marcus stared at the text, his mind racing. The honors group. That was the next step, the next level. His heart pounded in his chest. Could he do it? Could he take that leap? A smile slowly spread across his face. The answer was clear. He was ready. That evening, Marcus sat down to talk to his mom about the honors group. She had always supported him, even when he doubted himself, and he knew she would be proud of how far he had come. "Mom," Marcus began, his voice steady, "I've been given the opportunity to join the honors math group. Mr. Kavanaugh thinks I'm ready." His mom smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride. "I knew you could do it. You've worked so hard, Marcus. I'm proud of you. This is your moment. Go for it." As Marcus walked through the halls the next morning, he felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. He was no longer just a student. He was someone who had fought for his success, who had earned his place at the table. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was more than capable of handling them. He had faced his doubts, confronted his fears, and emerged stronger. And for the first time in his life, Marcus truly believed in his own potential. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Marcus had officially joined the honors group, and with that came a whole new level of challenges. The workload was more demanding, the problems were tougher, and the expectations were higher. But none of that fazed him. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment he had worked for. It was time to push himself even further. As Marcus sat in the first honors group study session, he realized just how much he had evolved. He had gone from the student who hesitated to answer a question, to the one who was now confident enough to tackle the toughest problems in the room. The other students in the group were sharp, quick-witted, and some of them had been in honors math for years. But Marcus no longer felt out of place. He didn't feel like he was behind or less than. He was exactly where he was meant to be. "All right, guys," Mr. Kavanaugh said as he walked into the room, holding a stack of papers. "We've got some advanced material to cover today. But don't worry, we'll take it one step at a time. Marcus, I think you'll enjoy this one." Marcus couldn't help but grin. Just a few months ago, he would have been terrified by the idea of advanced material. Now, he was eager to take it on. His hands itched to dive into the equations in front of him, to see what he could learn next. As the group worked through the problems, Marcus felt the familiar rush of focus and determination that had become second nature to him. Every time he reached a solution, it was more than just a sense of relief. It was validation of everything he had done to get here. It was a moment of pride. A few days later, after a particularly intense study session, Marcus walked out of the classroom and bumped into Jasmine and Mike, who were waiting for him. They had been waiting to hear how his first week in the honors group had gone. "Marcus." Jasmine grinned. "How was it? Was it tough?" Marcus nodded, his expression excited. "Yeah, it was challenging. But honestly, it feels good. I'm keeping up, and I'm actually enjoying it. I feel like I belong there." Mike slapped him on the back. "That's awesome, man. You've worked so hard to get here. I knew you could do it." Marcus's heart swelled with pride, and for a moment, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From the kid who had barely scraped through his math assignments, to now, being in an honors group, solving complex problems with ease. The journey had been long, and at times, it had felt impossible. But every challenge had been worth it. Jasmine smiled, her voice soft but encouraging. "You know, Marcus, it's not just about math. It's about everything. You've shown us that we can all push ourselves further than we think. You're an inspiration." Marcus was taken aback by her words. He hadn't thought of it like that, he hadn't realized that his own growth had inspired others. But looking at his friends, he saw the truth in it. They had all witnessed his transformation, his evolution. And in some way, that had lit a fire in them as well. "You know, I never thought I'd get here," Marcus admitted, his voice a little quieter. "I was always afraid that I wasn't good enough, that I'd never be able to handle it. But now I know that I'm capable of so much more than I ever realized." Jasmine nodded. "And that's why you're in the honors group. Not because you were just good at math, but because you believed in yourself. That's the real key." Mike grinned. "You're absolutely right. And it's awesome to see how far you've come. Who knows? Maybe next year, we'll all be in that group together." Marcus chuckled. "I'd like that. But for now, I'm just going to keep doing my best." As they continued to walk through the hallways together, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had not only found his place in the world of academics, but he had also found his place in his friendships. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. The next few weeks continued with the same intensity. Marcus spent countless hours studying, working through problems with his friends, and meeting with Mr. Kavanaugh for additional guidance. The material kept getting harder, but Marcus was ready for it. Each new challenge was an opportunity to learn more, to push his limits even further. Then came the big test, the one that would determine whether Marcus was truly ready for the honors level, whether his hard work had paid off. It was an intimidating exam, one that covered everything they had learned so far. It would be the ultimate test of his growth. In the days leading up to the test, Marcus felt the familiar flutter of nerves, but this time it wasn't fear. It was excitement. He was ready. He had done everything he could to prepare. There was no reason to be afraid. The night before the test, Marcus sat down at his desk, reviewing his notes one final time. He could hear his mom in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and the quiet hum of the house felt comforting. For the first time in a long while, he felt calm. As he closed his textbook and stretched, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jasmine. "Good luck tomorrow, Marcus. You've got this. I believe in you." He smiled, feeling the warmth of her words. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey. He had his friends, his teachers, and his own drive to keep him going. Mike's text came in next: "You've earned this. Go crush it." Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for his friends. They had been with him through every struggle, every setback, and every success. They had witnessed his growth, and now, they were cheering him on as he reached the next step in his journey. After a few more moments of quiet reflection, Marcus got up from his desk and walked to his mom. She was just finishing up dinner. "Mom," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready. Tomorrow, I'm going to give it my all." She smiled warmly at him. "I know you will, Marcus. And no matter what happens, I'm proud of you. You've already shown what you're capable of. The rest is just icing on the cake." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He had done everything he could to prepare. Now, all that was left was to trust himself and take that final step. The next day, as Marcus sat down at his desk for the exam, he took a deep breath. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was ready. This was his moment. He looked at the first problem and smiled to himself. He had earned this. It was his time to show just how far he had come. The exam room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the sound of pens scratching against the test sheets. Marcus sat at his desk, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. His hands were steady, his mind clear. He had prepared for this day, for this test, for this defining moment. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for. It wasn't about the grade anymore. It was about the journey, the late nights spent studying, the countless hours spent solving problems, the doubts that he had pushed aside. This was the test that would show him just how far he had come. He stared at the first question. It was complex, challenging, even, but he didn't flinch. He dove in, the numbers, symbols, and formulas dancing in his mind as if they were old friends. The fear he used to feel was gone. Now, it was replaced with a calm sense of purpose. He was no longer that uncertain student who questioned his abilities. He was the person who had earned his place here, and he would not let that go. As he worked through each problem, a quiet determination filled him. Each problem solved wasn't just a victory in the test, it was a reminder of the progress he had made. He had gone from struggling to even begin assignments, to completing the hardest problems with confidence. Every equation he wrote down now felt like a personal triumph. As the last few minutes of the test ticked away, Marcus looked at his answers one last time. He felt good about the work he had done. Even if he didn't get a perfect score, he knew he had given it his all. The math was no longer something that intimidated him. It was a challenge to be embraced. The proctor called for time, and Marcus handed in his exam. As he walked out of the room, a deep breath escaped his lips. It was over. The outcome didn't matter anymore. He had already won. The days leading up to the results were filled with anticipation. Marcus continued with his usual routine, attending classes, studying with Jasmine and Mike, and tackling new challenges. But the thought of the test lingered in the back of his mind. He knew that the result would be a reflection of his hard work, but he had grown to realize something even more important: the journey itself had been the real reward. Then, finally, the email came. He stared at his phone, his heart racing. "Your honors math midterm results," was the subject line. Marcus took a deep breath and clicked open the message. The feeling of relief, pride, and triumph washed over him all at once. Not only had he passed, but he had excelled. He had reached the pinnacle of his hard work, the place where all the doubts and struggles had finally culminated in success. Marcus smiled to himself. It wasn't just the letter on the screen that mattered. It was everything it represented. The doubts he had conquered, the hard work he had put in, the people who had supported him, all of it had led him here. That evening, Marcus sat down with his family to share the news. His mom's eyes lit up when she saw the grade, and her face broke into a proud smile. "I knew you could do it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've worked so hard, Marcus. I'm beyond proud of you." Marcus hugged her tightly. "I couldn't have done it without your support, Mom. You've always believed in me, even when I didn't." As they sat down to dinner, Marcus reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. He had come so far from the uncertain student who struggled with math. He had pushed past every challenge, every setback, and every moment of self-doubt. And now, here he was, stronger, more confident, and ready for whatever came next. The next day, as Marcus walked into his honors class, he felt a sense of belonging. This was where he was meant to be. He wasn't just another student in the group. He was a part of it, a valuable, capable member of a team that pushed each other to succeed. Mr. Kavanaugh smiled as he saw Marcus enter the room. "Great job on the test, Marcus," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I knew you had it in you." "Thanks, Mr. Kavanaugh," Marcus replied, his smile wide. "I've learned a lot, and I'm excited for what comes next." Mr. Kavanaugh nodded, clearly impressed with how far Marcus had come. "You've earned this. You've worked for it. Keep up the great work." As the class began, Marcus found himself focused, eager to take on the next challenge. There was no longer any question in his mind, he was ready for whatever came next. The future, full of possibilities and opportunities, was waiting for him, and he was determined to seize it. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued to thrive in his new environment. The work didn't get any easier, but he didn't shy away from it. Each new challenge was just another opportunity to grow, to prove to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. His friends, too, began to notice the change. Jasmine, Mike, and the others were proud of his accomplishments, but they were also inspired by the way he carried himself. They saw how much he had grown, not just in his math skills, but in his confidence and belief in himself. Marcus had become the person he had always hoped to be, someone who didn't let obstacles define him, someone who faced challenges head-on and refused to give up. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. As the school year came to an end, Marcus stood on the precipice of the next chapter in his life. He had already accomplished so much, but he knew there was more to come. He was no longer the same person who had walked into Mr. Kavanaugh's classroom months ago. He had learned, grown, and proved to himself that he was capable of anything he set his mind to. And as he looked around at his friends, his family, and his teachers, Marcus knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?